All right, there we go. So I'm Mike Saunders, principal consultant with Red Siege. I've got Jason Downey, one of our testers here, and general all-around badass. And we're going to talk to you about In Defense of Defense in depth, talking about some ways that defenses that we've run into when we're doing tests that go beyond just the basic stuff that have. And some of it actually is really basic stuff, but it's things that are just putting up roadblocks in our way, putting up roadblocks in attackers' way, allowing you to get visibility onto what an attacker might be doing and slowing down their tempo in their operations. It gives you a chance to catch them. So if you're not on the Discord, it's redsiege.com/Discord. Join us there, get in on the conversation. Get on the chat over here. As Jacon said earlier, if you want to ask a question, throw it in the chat, one of the various chat platforms. We should see it. Put it in Discord, and we will take those as we get time. So without any further ado, I'd like to turn it over to Jason. Jason's going to kick us off talking about some things we've seen from an external perspective.
Yes, sir. And really, I feel like we did this to ourselves, right? Like we had the SiegeCast last week of all the awesome ways that we just destroyed some defenders. Well, not destroyed, right? Like we provided value to our clients. And then like karma just came right back at us. And I know I've been struggling a lot this month. And well, let's talk about some external stuff. One of obviously the first thing that any attacker is going to try is to try to jump over that external perimeter. And fortunately, like all of our clients that we tested over the last month or so, had some pretty strong external facing like hardening and sanitization things that they had done. One of the really common things that allow us to jump perimeter is if there's too many services that are facing externally. Things like having RDP opened externally so that an administrator can do some kind of work from home is a definite no. Not seeing any SMB facing the internet lately, but it's definitely been there in the past. That's definitely a no. And then also there's a lot of I feel like I've seen a lot of management portals that are, like web login portals where you can log in that are externally facing, and that can be sometimes like if somebody has, if they get a set of credentials, and even though they can't exactly get internally, like maybe that data can be gotten to via an external portal. So definitely, it was really cool to see, all that really good service hardening and sanitization in place so that, we couldn't make those easy pivots in. And there's a lot of strong passwords in place. Like I know that we preach very heavy, like you should have 15 character passwords or longer, because if it's shorter, if you've got those spring 2021s and those spring 2022 and winter 2021, none of those worked for me this time, and that's a lot of my external wins. So definitely those strong passwords in place. Good multi-factor authentication in place all across the enterprise, like not just on your VPN, not just for your Azure or your M365, that you have any login portal that's externally facing, like they all had MFA. I know last month, we talked about using that MFA sweep utility, and that typically finds those holes that we look for. And man, this time it came back with nothing on any of my tests. So I'm like, well, they've got MFA everywhere. So I guess I'm dead in the water from that aspect. And they're really like, we don't see, problems with like SPF and DMARC and DKIM, too often. But one thing that I definitely always check is for those records, right? Like if you have an outdated SPF record, or if your DKIM is not set up properly, then chances are that's going to play into my social engineering aspect, where I'm going to do my OSINT, I'm going to find users' email addresses and yada yada yada. If you don't have SPF in place properly, then I'm going to pretend to be you from like a Mailgun or MailChimp or something, right? And it's going to look like an internal email and you're not going to know any different. So luckily all that stuff was in place too. And yeah, definitely makes for a rough start of any test.
Absolutely. All right. Thanks, Jason. I'm going to switch over and talk about some of the things we've seen on an internal on internal tests, talking about host protections, and you'll have to forgive me, I'm actually got old school. I've got paper here because I don't have enough monitors. So, thinking about one client in particular, but we've seen this in many clients, places where they've got the general basic things done. They've got good telemetry that they're collecting from their endpoints. In this particular place, client was they were making use of the M365 ecosystem, right? Like anything that they could ship off to M365, they were using, Microsoft Defender ATP, things like that. But as soon as I land out of the box, I look at what do I have for permissions. I'm not a local admin. I'm not in any groups that give me any kind of elevated access to the system. When I look at the system, it's fully patched. There aren't any patches that are missing. The AV, in this case, Defender, the definitions are up to date. Nothing's on fire over here, Ian. That's my humidifier, in case anyone's wondering, over there. And other basic things like unattended installation answers files, right? Like those you see in C, Windows, Panther, or a few other directories like that. Answer files that are used for automating the installation of the system, and by default, they'll contain a username and a password that's used for provisioning the machine. Oftentimes, those usernames and passwords are also domain users that can have elevated privileges, and then we can use those credentials to go on and compromise the local system and possibly other systems on the network. We don't see that. In this case, things like the command shell were disabled, but we could use PowerShell, for instance. So there was something that we could use to get around the command shell being enabled or disabled. We also saw things like C script and W script worked for code execution. So there was a lot of good things, but there were also opportunities for improvement. And so there were some ways that we could get some code execution on the system. Now, the client was using Defender and Defender ATP, which is great for us because we can pretty much always get code execution against those. Not to say that once it's running, like we're running silently. It makes noise and it continues to make a lot of noise with the properly configured Defender deployment. Yeah, I can get code execution, but you're going to see what I'm doing. So now it's a matter of, are you paying attention? So, once we're on those boxes, we start looking through what binaries can we use to execute code. And so I'm going to talk about the lulbin, lulbas project a little bit. There's a lot of different utilities that you can use to execute code, right? Like you see here, appinstaller.exe can be used to download, and at.exe you can use for executing, things like that. We'll go through a list of what's on the system and how we can use those binaries. And in some places, they're wide open. In some places, many of them are blocked. In fact, the client I'm on right now has blocked a lot of those kinds of binaries. And so we're trying to do anything, and it's like, nope, sorry, that's not allowed. You're not authorized to run it. So looking for those lulbins that a user doesn't typically use, like does a user typically use C script or W script? Probably not. So if it's being used, maybe send up an alert on it. Also, another interesting aspect, not related to the binaries we were using, but we got our initial foothold. I got our C2 established because the site was classified as shopping. And some places do not decrypt shopping. They're not doing TLS inspection on shopping, healthcare and medical, and banking related things because they don't want to be scraping, credit card and other financial information. So we got lucky in the proxy that this client was using, classified our site as banking. Everything else was like malicious, phishing and that. But this one site classified it as shopping. And it was like, all right, here we go. So they were blind to that aspect. So there was a lot of defenses, but there were gaps. And that's why defense in depth is important, because there's going to be code execution. Like invariably, there's going to be some code execution at some point. Can you catch it?
So real quick before you go to the next
ahead.
section, question for you. Let's say, how many of these was, say, were you stopped immediately by EDR? Or how many times did the client forward you like an alert afterwards, say, hey, we didn't stop you, but we saw you. What are some of your experiences in last month, sort of in that aspect?
Yeah. So with regard to that, this one particular client I'm thinking about, like, saw everything. Like, if I thought about sneezing, he's like, "You're going to sneeze." It was just about that that level of visibility. The thing with the Defender ATP ecosystem is it doesn't block a lot of things. At least not by default. It's not blocking a lot of things. It has some gaps where it's like the alerts that the client was seeing were saying, hey, I'm seeing Cobalt Strike happening. Mm-hmm. And then I'm not able to kill it. Like, it couldn't kill the beacons. It could see them, but for some reason could not terminate the processes. But in other EDRs, things like, say, CrowdStrike, for instance, going up against Falcon, very frequently there's so many things from a beacon perspective that we're not able to do. Current tests that I'm on, like Carbon Black, I can't do most of the code execution techniques that I would use on other tests don't work because they're unapproved DXEs, they're unapproved DLLs. And in this case, using the Lulbin project, what the Lulbin project is doing for a lot of things is what I would say, like proxying an EXE or a DLL, right? Like, I'm going to run this program, what actually runs this other program, which is my malicious program. Well, Carbon Black sees this program being loaded, and since my program isn't approved, blocks it. So it's kind of a mixed bag, but there aren't many times that what we're doing goes completely undetected. I would say more often than not, what happens is we fly under the radar because other things are happening and we're not making enough alerts to get caught.
Yeah, and one of the things that the great Corey Overstreet told me, right, is like, if we're trying to, like, if we've got a client laptop and we're trying to avoid that detection, a lot of times these EDR solutions, if we have a client laptop and we're trying, even if we're not connected to the network but connected to the internet, like, that's going to send alerts back to them and they're going to see us coming. So we Corey and I are working together, and we typically fire up Clonezilla, right? Like, we plug it in and we're making a duplicate, or like a 1-to-1 image of this ISO. We're taking it offline. We're doing everything we got to do, and then we're restoring the laptop back to its original spot before we put it back online. And that allows us as attackers to try to, do all of our testing without alerting the security team that we're coming. Well, turns out, client this month was like, oh, hey, we're going to boot all blocking from a USB drive. Oh, and by the way, yes, we actually put an administrator password on the BIOS. So, yeah, that definitely squished that for us.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yep.
Like, if you've got local control, you got physical control of an asset, there's a lot of things that you can do that a lot of clients don't consider within their threat model. They don't look at it and say, well, what happens if someone actually has physical access to our laptop? And so then the BIOS isn't protected. And once the BIOS isn't protected, maybe you prevent booting from USB, but if I can get into the BIOS and reconfigure it to make my device be the first boot device, okay, well, there's some things I can do. So for sure, definitely think about those local protections as well. Yeah. Anything else on that you got?
No.
All right.
Yeah. We'll keep it rolling.
Yeah. So another interesting thing, one of the things that we'll do on just about every test early on, if it's like a assume breach or an internal where we get credentials through some manner, is we're going to look and do Kerberoasting, or at least look and see what accounts have spins, service principal names defined. And then if you're using something like Rubius, you can do a query to say like, show me the spins where the password's older than, this date. And the reason we do that is because those older service accounts are the ones most likely to have weak passwords versus ones that have been changed more recently. And we do those Kerberoasting, but we do it low and slow. Like grab one ticket and then don't grab another one for 45 minutes or an hour. And then when I do grab the next one, make sure like each subsequent one isn't on a regular boundary if someone's looking at like kind of a frequency thing, like, hey, it makes the same query once an hour. Well, with the Defender for Identity ecosystem, I did there happened to be one spin at this client. I pulled one ticket and it fired off an alert. I'm like,
Ooh.
all right. Like, and it was like, that's great. I did one ticket, literally one ticket. And that's one of the things we've seen in that Microsoft M365 Defender for Identity, Defender for Cloud type of ecosystem is that it's got a lot of visibility that you don't have that you don't necessarily have by default in other types of SIMs and EDR type configurations. Yeah.
And if you as defenders are looking for sort of an easy alerting solution for that kind of stuff, make some honeypot accounts. Like make a service account. Yeah, make a service account that's not actually in use by any service. And when a pen tester like us sees that, oh, this password hasn't been reset in 190 days, like we're gearing up to go. Yeah, like you already know, right? Because there's no service actually using that service account. So when we're trying to get it, you already know. Yeah, that got me busted about 2 weeks ago. So.
Yep. If you're doing Kerberoasting for an account that that isn't used anywhere else, like monitor to see if that's been accessed. Same thing with password spraying. I have been caught that way a couple of times recently, which hadn't seen much in the past, where they had more than one honeypot account set up, so that when we did password spray using something like domain password spray, it pulled the list of users, sprayed them, and hey, that person's never supposed to log in. There's an alert. One thing, if you are doing that, make sure that you've actually authenticated with that account at some point. Maybe do it when you change the password on that at some rotation once a year or something like that, and also authenticate with it. Because if I see an account that's been created but never logged into, and it's got juicy permissions, that's more of a tell that something might be up. We did have a couple of questions. Falcon 712, does the BIOS have a password lockout? In this case, Jason, do you want to talk about that? Was there any kind of password lockout you saw on the BIOS there?
So there wasn't exactly a password lockout, but with just a BIOS password, so it's about like I didn't we're not actually in the system, right? So I couldn't run like any sort of like password spraying tools. To be honest, I don't have a rubber ducky, so like I don't know if a rubber ducky could have worked in that regard to just do like a pure like brute force password spray. But I guess in a sense I was already beaten down on the password part because I know they all have 15 character randomly generated long passwords they have for everything. So I didn't try to do a password brute force, but I don't. What a rubber ducky would have worked for that? Can you use a rubber ducky from?
I honestly don't know.
Because I know it looks like a keyboard. Look, it looks like a keyboard driver, right? And like that's how it. Yeah, and I don't know if that would have worked for that specific scenario, but that's a good thought either way.
Yeah. And then Jason says, are you seeing more orgs with SMB signing enabled? Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. Definitely seeing that in more places, seeing fewer and fewer hosts that have things like Landman, what am I thinking of? NetBIOS and LAN Manager. I'm completely blanking on LLMNR. There we go. Yeah. So things like NetBIOS, LLMNR, we're not seeing that in nearly many environments. And we're seeing that SMB signing is required and enforced in more places for sure. And yeah, Falcon, you're right. The USB rubber ducky does simulate a keyboard, and it shouldn't matter whether it's like Windows, the OS is fully loaded, as long as there's like an HID driver that's working, so the BIOS can read a USB keyboard, so it should work.
Yeah.
But never tried it.
Yeah, I'm gonna put them on my list to try for sure, because next time I run into it, that's awesome if I can just brute force my way through it. That's good to know.
Yeah. So another thing I was thinking about, Microsoft Sentinel. At one point we fired up a DNS beacon because, hey, why not set up a DNS beacon and see what happens there? Sentinel, without like any work at all, very quickly alerted, said, hey, you've got something happening here. It saw that the DNS queries that Cobalt Strike uses with the DNS beacon. So another thing, very impressed. Another way of detecting activity that's happening. We've got a test we're doing right now where we cannot sorry, Jaycon's messaging me something and very throwing me off here. So we've got a test where egress is otherwise blocked, but we can do DNS as an exfiltration channel and as a C2 channel. But if you're monitoring for those kinds of things, there's another way to detect bad things that are happening. Another thing that we see protections in place, not just on the local host, but from a lateral movement perspective, right? Like, okay, let's say we get some code execution on this host, but we're going to need to go somewhere with it. How can we do that? In the one test, I've ran into in a few places, something called Windows Deployment Services, which is kind of a toolkit you can get from Microsoft for automating deployments of systems, basically building a gold image. And by default, it has this share that's something like WDS share or something like that. And there's a user that lots of times is WDS user. And in this particular situation, I found this share that had the password for the WDS user. Now, the WDS user, I've found this in other places, the user account wasn't WDS user, but what that account does is that account then during your imaging process will be used to join the workstation to the domain once it gets done doing the image. And so it doesn't necessarily need to be a privileged account in the domain. It just has to have rights to join something to the domain. And if it can join something to the domain, by default, it is assigned ownership of that object. So if you create a machine, and join it to the domain, the account that joins it to the domain is given ownership of that attribute or of that object. And one of the things that it will also get is the all extended rights permission, which allows that account to read the lapse password if you're using lapse. So in this particular environment, I get an account that's the owner of a bunch of machines, all the workstations, and it can read the password for lapse for each of the workstations, because they're using a unique password on every workstation for the administrator accounts. Like, great, we want to see that. But if I can get that lapse password, I am now administrator. So I have that, right? Okay, great. I can use that, and I can use it to log into workstations. Nope, can't log into workstations. The account was restricted. They didn't allow the account to log on locally to the system. So there was very little I could do with it. I had the credentials, but one of the last things that happens as it's being joined at the domain, the GPOs are being applied, is that say, no, you can't log in. So there were some difficulty using those credentials that I had. I was able to use them in certain contexts and get beacons running as the admin user, but I'm only the admin on that box and I can't go anywhere. And I'll talk about that in the privileged escalation section. But also having some credentials, and we tested with this WDS user. We tested with some server administrator accounts, people that were actually in the server administrator group, and some other privileged accounts, and saw some really impressive things here. And we've seen in other places where a year ago, we didn't see these kinds of things in place. Try to move laterally, and SMB to all the servers is blocked except the file servers. RDP is blocked to everything except your RDS servers. WMI, PowerShell remoting. We're starting to see that in more and more places. Not a lot, but we're seeing it more than we did before. And when you block things like SMB and you block WMI and PowerShell remoting and RDP, you're very much limiting an attacker's ability to move laterally through your network. If you're using, depending on how you're firewalling it off, you're also allowing the opportunity to generate logs from those denies and then collect that information and alert on it. And not just blocking the protocol from doing from being received. You can also do things like blocking some of those lull bins. You can use IPsec rules, you can use Windows firewall rules pushed by GPO. There's a few different ways to do it, but things that we're seeing are things like preventing commonly exploited binaries from doing network communication. So things like calc and notepad, because there's never been a lazy attacker that just copied a POC that injected into notepad, right? Like that happens. Notepad should never be communicating to the internet. So if it is, there's a problem. So block it. Things like C script and W script and some of those other common lull bins that don't have any business talking to the internet. Think about MS build, for instance. There's a few things like that. Block their ability to speak outward from the machine because they're only really needed to be used on that machine. So multiple layers of preventing lateral movement. So in case something fails, you still have another control to fall back on.
Well, yeah, I was
You
looking
saw
for a
something
quick,
like that.
yeah, I was looking for a quick gap to kind of jump in a little bit, right? Because I know that was a lot in one breath. I guess what are some of those mitigating controls that you spoke of them sort of in generality, but what's a couple of them that they had in place that actually stopped you on some of these tests? What was it like a carbon black, or was it like a network-based firewall? Like, what are some different things that prevented you from taking these steps?
Yeah, so we have seen a few things. One of the things I've seen is Windows firewall rules pushed down by GPO that prevent certain binaries from speaking out to the internet, things like C script, W script, whatever. Also, firewall rules pushed from GPO that say we're not going to allow connections to SMB and connections to RDP and connections to PowerShell remoting and all those things, except from certain authorized management consoles. Like no one needs to speak to a workstation over any of those protocols for the most part. There's no reason. And before you go, but wait, there's this thing. Yes, there are. And that's why I said authorized management consoles. Things like your big fix if you're using that for patching or whatever. Those kinds of things. Management consoles that need to speak to a workstation, where those are at. Allow those to speak, block everything else from speaking to the workstations. You want to go to the next level? No one needs to speak to SMB and RDP and PowerShell remoting and all those other things on a server, except for cases where it's needed. If something isn't a file server, why is SMB open to the user segment from the user segment? Block that off. That's this one client, like they blocked off everything. And, I have maybe been kind of down on things like layer 7 firewalls in the past. I was like, it's just a gimmick. Let me tell you, I was converted. There was it was amazing because after the test was done talking with this one particular client, I had credentials that were server admin accounts, but I couldn't log into any servers. Even the servers that I could see, I couldn't log into, or that I knew existed, I couldn't log into. And there was a really complicated path because this layer 7 firewall, which means it's identity aware. So if you've got an identity aware firewall, it says, hey, Mike, you are an authorized server admin. You can log into this server and they had a jump box set up that then allowed them to get into a management network. And the only way you could get to a jump box was from an authorized workstation using a narrow set of credentials. So let's say Jason is one of the server admins, and I steal Jason's token from a process, or I get his credentials otherwise, but I'm not on his machine. I'm on some other machine over here on the network. Because I'm not Jason, and I am Jason, but I'm not coming from Jason's workstation, I can't get to anything else in the network. So those kinds of layered firewall approaches to say tying things to identity for one, and then saying you can only get from this location to these other locations. So no one should be logging into a server over RDP unless they're coming from the jump host,
Right. Yeah. And so from a defensive perspective, we've always talked about, you should segment your network. I think it was, the first SiegeCast I did, like my second month as a pen tester, was talking about networking fundamentals. And at the beginning of that, I was like, hey, man, like you should segment your network. Right. And, there's the extreme for that. And on one of the tests that I had one of the full extremes of network segmentation, where not only could I not speak to things on different networks, but the only thing that I could speak to on the network that I was assigned to, because I was on my own VLAN, was my default gateway. Where they gave me the, it was a, internal test. They put my machine, they said, hey, here you go, scan the network, see what you can get. I'm like, well, I can see the default gateway, and it's patched, so I guess this network test is finished, because it literally limited my ability to go anywhere.
And that's something that you would call private VLANing, right? Right. That's typically
Yeah.
what's referred to as. In private VLANing, every client is essentially in their own VLAN. One place you see that pretty frequently is on a wireless network. You'll see that implemented, especially like guest wireless networks where
Coffee
they'll
shops
segment
and
it off.
hotels
Coffee
and
shops, yeah, you can't see anyone except yourself in the gateway. But we almost never see that on wired networks in the enterprise. But we've seen it in a few places. And let me tell you, when I can't see anything else, it really limits my ability to do lateral movement.
Right. Especially right, if not only do they have private VLANing, but they have things like STP, disabled for, the port that I'm connected to on the switch. They're not using that default one VLAN. So when I'm trying to VLAN hop to even, on a layer 2 segment, like jump from network to network, well, I guess not networks at that point, but you're jumping from VLAN to VLAN, there's nothing, and it does a whole heck of a lot. We talk about, the low level segmentation, where it's like if you have administrative portals, block those to regular users. And the middle is doing like, the jump box with authentication, like you talked about. And then like your full extreme is, private VLANs for every box. And I got to tell you, like that stops an attacker like in their tracks. Like we have to ask for a power up at that point. Like, hey, like I know you hired us for a week, but turns out you're really good. You want to help me out? Maybe we can move a little further, Yep.
Help, please.
Help.
I'm not above admitting that
No.
I'm getting kicked in the face here.
Yep.
So speaking of getting kicked in the face, having local admin and being able to do nothing with it. We've had that where we get on a box, and let's say a box has run as PPL protections enabled, right? LSAS protections. So when you have run as PPL set, it means it's process protection light. We can't dump credentials from LSAS. You set a registry key. By default, I can't just go and dump the credentials out of LSAS after that's been set. However, there are tools like PPL Killer, and PPL Killer is a tool that will basically remove the process protection light protections from LSAS. You have to be elevated context to do this, but if you've got PPL, there you go, right there, PPL Killer. So if you've got PPL Killer running, you can remove LSA protections. Now, some things you can do to prevent against PPL Killer would be, one, don't allow arbitrary executables to run if they drop it on disk. Okay, great. Another thing you can do, and I've seen in place, are just the vanilla attack surface reduction rules, right? Um, the vanilla attack surface reduction rules that you can get from Microsoft and apply to Defender will prevent things like recently compiled binaries from executing. So even though I had PPL Killer built and had been on my machine for 6 months or something like that, when I transferred it to the client machine, its date, essentially its birth date as a file, is new. It's created the time that I dropped it on there. Like, you can't transfer that, hey, this was compiled 6 months ago. And so it's a new file. So attack surface reduction rules say this new executable is suspicious because it's new and we don't know what it is. So we couldn't run it. Defender was like, no, not for you. If it had been 6 months old, maybe could have ran it, because I could run arbitrary executables at this place, but they had to have been around for a while. So in this case, I couldn't run. You can modify timestamps, yes, but it is not easy. And modifying timestamps on the box required using some custom executables that I couldn't run because of timestamps. I ran out of time to come with other ways to attack that. Not saying, and keep in mind, none of these things that we're saying are absolute. It's why it's defense in defense of defense in depth, right? It's layers, so that when one layer fails, you got another layer to fall back on. So in this case, run PPL Killer. I can't run PPL Killer because, hey, I don't have rights to do this. So what did I do? I tried to stop Defender. I'm an admin. I'm administrator. I'll just stop Defender. Net stop win defend, or whatever it is. I run that. Tamper protection's enabled. So I stop it and I can run PPL Killer, verify that it works, and then I try to run it and actually do the thing, and it doesn't work. And I was like, it worked literally 15 seconds ago. What just happened? So looking at the telemetry, come to find out that tamper protection's in place. It detected that it was disabled and then re-enabled it. And then because of tamper protection, subsequent attempts to stop Defender failed. It just refused to listen to like net stop win defend type of commands. It was just like, no, I'm not going to do this. So another fun thing then at that point, there are ways around these things. If you're an admin, just give yourself an exclusion, right? So ultimately what I ended up doing was saying, PPL Killer, you're allowed to run. And then it's like, okay, come on in. But there were all those layers of defenses. And in that process, I created a bunch of noise, right? There are things, telemetry was generated, alerts were received. It was a chance to catch me doing these things.
Yeah, and you're talking alerts of all kinds of different things. Like, number one, you're a user that was running a net command for any reason, like whether that's to try to, basically to kill that process. Are you alerting on that? Are you now alerting on this new executable that hasn't been seen before? Like, is that automatic? Is it auto shut down, or is the blue team not responding? What other ways we're alerting that? Are you now trying to move laterally with this new process that's scanning for SMB or something, right? Like those 3 or 4 different levels of alerting that all could have taken place and caught you.
Talking about a crazy seeing a process, doing something and alerting on it. So I don't know which piece of the Defender ecosystem does this, but I decided, hey, let's run. I don't remember, was it Bloodhound? I don't think it was Bloodhound. I was running another tool. It was running within an Edge browser process. And the net result of it is that it issued an LDAP query. And the Defender for identity ecosystem, I believe that's where it came from, just Defender in general, I guess, said, hey, there's a suspicious LDAP query that came from a process that doesn't normally make LDAP queries. So the Edge browser process issued an LDAP query, which it said, that's odd. It doesn't normally do that. So think about session prepping, as an attacker, and what is expected behavior. Normally running in an Edge browser process is good. right? Like once you're in there, most things work. In this case, fired off an alert because it did something it doesn't normally do. Man, I had something.
Sorry,
We'll go to Falcon.
it cut you off at the wrong time.
Yeah, no problem. No, I think it was, I was waiting to answer Falcon's question. I forgot about it. Falcon says, I wonder if you made your own file server with a Linux VM using Samba, would you get around the timestamp issue? And that is a possibility. However, you have to be able to get a Linux VM into the environment. And so if I can control like the file server it's coming from, if I can present a file server, I can control a lot of those things, and that's absolutely true. For instance, if I can egress from your network on 445, yeah, I can set up a file server and just grab it remotely over the internet. I've done it before. Same thing with like web dev, right? There's a lot of SMB-like interactions with web dev servers. But if you're blocking that from egressing from your network, then it's harder. Now I have to have a way of getting that VM inside your network, which if I'm in a position that I can already run my own VM inside your network, you've got other problems. But definitely it's an interesting thought experiment for sure. So what was I thinking about? Oh yeah, we try to stop Defender, right? Okay, I give myself an exclusion. I can now run PPL Killer. I'm going to dump LSAS and get the credentials of a server administrator that has logged into my machine, right? Like I'm going to do that. No, I'm not, because secure boot was enabled. And when secure boot is enabled, it doesn't matter what you do, whether if you change the LSA protection registry key or you run something like PPL Killer, you are not getting those creds out of memory. Now, there may have been other ways around that. I am not an expert in all things LSAS protection, but I do know that because secure boot was enabled, I couldn't immediately get credentials out of memory after I ran PPL Killer. It ran, it said it worked. I'm like, hey, give me the creds. I don't have the creds. What's going on? Turns out that secure boot was enabled there. So multiple layers of defense. Again, there were multiple things that helped protect and defend these systems. Another interesting one that we've seen, and you kind of alluded to it earlier, was joining machines to a domain. And you ran into that just recently.
Oh, absolutely. I mean, number one, one of the things that we're used to taking advantage of is the default DS machine account quota. It's 10 by default, right? Where any user can add 10 machines to the
Correct.
domain. Which, number one, come on, Microsoft, like let's get it together in that aspect. But a lot of our clients don't know about it, or don't realize it, or don't realize the implication of it. A user should not be able to add 10 machines for any reason. Someone was asked about like mounting a VM, right? So if we had credentials and this was set to like 2, and it was a phone and a machine assigned to our thing, if we try to spin up a new VM and try to attach it to domain, like it's not going to fly because of that, because the account code has been met. It stops it kind of in its tracks. And then I guess once again to circle back around, someone's talking about like the rubber ducky thing, and sort of a similar way to stop us from adding stuff. I had a client where it prevented any sort of external storage being mounted unless it had like a pre-approved encryption key. So even trying to like take screenshots of what I was doing on the machine and put it up, like put it in a thumb drive and copy it over so I could add it to the report, I couldn't do it because I plugged in the USB drive, and I don't know. I honestly don't know what it was. It might have been Carbon Black, right? It pops up and it says, "Hey, this doesn't have the encryption set, yada yada yada." And it's got a note: if you need a thumb drive, contact the IT department. Like, oh, so that got to like take pictures of the screen with my phone and email it to myself so I can add it to the report.
Yep, I've run into that a few places too.
Yeah, I mean, you're talking about the ability to stop data exfiltration, from a local aspect. That's huge. Because what if this laptop was stolen and it was an accountant and it had, financial records? Yeah, I've got it on the laptop, but it's not like I could plug it in and email it out. Like I got to take pictures. And yeah,
and monitoring for that unknown USB usage. I had on a test one time where the only way I could get my payload, I was having a heck of a time getting my payload onto the workstation, but they allowed USB. So I threw my payload on a USB drive and transferred to the machine. And then shortly thereafter, I get a call like, hey, did you plug a USB into the machine? Because they were monitoring and they saw a device that wasn't something approved getting connected to the box. So another thing that that you can look for and monitor for. That machine account quota thing, one thing I thought was really interesting was we've gotten creds, we get creds, we can VPN into the network, it doesn't require MFA. And, if you actually think of a practical attack scenario, if I can VPN into your network from my own device that I can run a VM on, I can now join a device to your domain. And the significance of that for the people that aren't aware, there's multiple things, like there's some unconstrained delegation type of attacks, things that go on with being able to add that. But also, if I'm an admin on my box already, and then I join it to your domain, you may have GPOs that apply a bunch of protections to my box. But my local admin account is still there. So now I can log out, log back in as local admin, and undo a lot of the protections you've done. And now I have like my attack box on your network. So there's another reason for preventing against that. You were going to say, Jason?
Oh yeah, I was just gonna add, like, it popped in my brain. Have client laptop and yada yada yada, and I had plugged in. I have a Razer Death Adder mouse, right? Like just a gaming mouse that I use for my regular whatever. But I plug it in. It's got like a software installer that automatically comes with the mouse, so that you can customize your LED buttons, because that's a thing. And that generated an alert, and I got an email from a security team that was like, "Hey, did you try to execute something from a USB stick?" And no, I didn't. And then it clicked. So it's like once again, that monitoring for external stuff trying to go into their network from a USB storage device, technically a mouse this time, right? Like they saw it, they stopped it, they alerted on it.
And if anyone remembers, it wasn't very long ago, sometime last year, I believe, that Razer devices, so when you install these USB devices and the drivers get installed automatically, there's like a helper that's registered with Microsoft, and it runs with a certain privilege level sometimes. Well, the Razer software that installed the drivers and everything ran as system. So you could take something like, I believe, a USB rubber ducky. You can emulate different kinds of devices. You can change essentially the ID, the hardware ID that tells it what kind of device it is. It might not be a rubber ducky, but it's one of those kinds of devices. So you could make it look like it was a Razer device, and then have it execute your payload, and it would be running as system. So another reason for layers of defense. Yeah, there we go. Another reason for layers of defense, because lots of times once we're local admin, it's that close to game over, because there's some cred that we can use. But if we can't move laterally through the network with using those creds that we have, and we certainly can't do it running silently because you're watching those types of creds, you're a lot better chance you're going to catch us, and you're going to catch the attackers that manage to exploit a system on your network. It's 249. We got or 349 or some other 49, depending where you're at. We got time for questions, folks, and we want your questions.
And all right, we're getting into. You can't even say it. No, I'm already going.
I already filled up my bingo space.
We are coming into the end of today's SiegeCast. We are going to take any final questions that we have, which I think you guys have covered a lot, and people have kind of been absorbing it. But I'll give you probably another 5 minutes to put in a question. If you don't, we are going to end this broadcast. Again, if you haven't gone over to the Discord, redsiege.com/Discord, you can see all the links. There's a lot of things that Mike talked about with documentation from Microsoft during the things he talked about with running PPL that you can find in the webcast section. A lot of documentation there. I tried to fly them all, but sometimes you're trying to keep up and you just can't. So anything you want to learn about what Mike was discussing there, go ahead and go over to the webcast section of the Discord and read all about it. And if there is no more questions, I am going to say thank you.
I'm seeing there was someone about to type something in Discord.
Oh, who it be? Let's give him. I'll give him another minute.
There we go.
Oh, Quincy. I love Quincy.
Does that relate to the SOC state awareness because they know operators are in the work, or are you getting caught due to business as usual general state of awareness? So it's both. We have done tests where most of our tests are done where the blue team, the SOC, is aware that the test is going on. But they still saw what we were doing. They just didn't actively respond. We have also done tests where the blue team did not know at all that we were there, and decided to be like, hey, something bad's going on, let's respond. And sometimes they didn't do it right away. We're able to social engineer a little bit of the time to be biased sometime, but the eyes were on us. And then at that point, I can think of one test I did last year where the ruse was I was helping HR, and so I had a custom executable that was like HR employee engagement survey.exe, and it generated some alert, and they're like, hey, what was this? And I was like, oh, I'm sorry, I'm a consultant here helping Amy in HR develop an employee engagement survey process. And they're like, okay.
Yeah.
But we're watching.
But it really kind of, it goes back to maximizing the value of the pen test, right? Like, not only should you be testing technical controls, but you should be, testing your telemetry and your security operations center or whatever. Like, those things can all be done on the same test.
Yep.
So, yeah, defense in depth. If a tool doesn't catch it, maybe a person will. If a person doesn't catch it, maybe, something else will, right? But yeah.
Yeah, and we've talked about here preventative and detective controls, right? Like, preventative is we prevent something from happening. We got a firewall rule that doesn't allow CScript to do internet access. Well, on the test that I'm on right now, demonstrated code execution using CScript and some gadget to JScript to actually inject an executable into an Explorer process from CScript. So CScript never made an internet connection, but my beacon was spawned from CScript. My beacon's talking to the internet. But if I, as a regular user, if I don't run CScript regularly, and all of a sudden I'm running CScript, you had a preventative control, put a firewall rule in place to keep it from speaking to the internet. That failed because it didn't account for the concept of process injection. But if you're monitoring for suspicious LLBIN usage, you can go, hey, wait, he just ran CScript. And then depending on what's happening on the workstation, your ability to collect telemetry, you can go back and go, hey, wait a second, CScript appeared to run this thing, and then we had this Explorer process was injected, and now I see these comms to this site from there. So that's why we always talk about that detective and preventative controls. Defense in depth. Don't just rely on, we block things. Well, what happens when blocking fails?
Right.
And with that, we'll say that is the end. Thank you, Mike Saunders and Jason Downey, for the SiegeCast in defense of Defense in Depth. If you're watching this later on, feel free to like and subscribe, hit all the buttons. You can follow us on Twitter at RedSiege, and we will see you next time. Appreciate everybody joining us today.
Thanks, everyone. Thanks, Jason. Thanks, Justin.
No problem. Thanks for having me.